His disciples were not able to deal with the problem. Where had Jesus been? Well, he was being transfigured on the mountain. That's where Jesus was when he first came to his disciples and couldn't be healed. And we celebrate the Feast of the Transfiguration tomorrow. Tomorrow is the Feast of the Transfiguration. A couple things I'd like to say about that, because I probably won't get such a big crowd out tomorrow for the Transfiguration. I'll say a few words about it today. When we think of the Transfiguration, we often think in terms of divinization and the glory of God. But it's very important that we look at how the Transfiguration takes place in the Gospels, in terms of where it takes place, and then how the Church understands it. So in the Gospels, when is Jesus transfigured? He has just asked his disciples, "Whom do men say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Flesh and blood hasn't revealed it to you." And Peter's feeling really well. And then immediately Jesus says, "I have to be killed." So this is the first time, 3 times in the Gospel, he tells his disciples that he's going to Jerusalem to be killed, and on the 3rd day he would rise again. And his disciples don't understand this. In fact, Peter tries to stop him, right? And just after being told that flesh and blood had not revealed this to him, but the Father from heaven, Peter tries to get between Jesus and the cross. You can't get between Jesus and the cross. And Jesus says to him, "Get behind me, Satan." Because it's only the devil. It's only the devil that wants to take the cross out of our life. The cross is what saves us. We hate it. We don't like it. But it's the cross that saves us. And immediately he takes Peter, James, and John up to a mountain and is transferred. Well, immediately, it says 6 days later. The next thing that happens in the text. He takes Jesus up onto, Jesus takes his 3 closest disciples, Peter, James, and John. Peter, the one who just said, "Satan, get behind me," he takes him, James and John, up to the mountain and is transfigured in front of them. Now, the hymn of the feast, or one of the hymns called the Kontakion, one of the main hymns of the feast, tells us that he was transfigured on the mountain before his crucifixion, because this is his final year. He's on his way to Jerusalem to be crucified, and he's transfigured in front of the disciples, and the hymn says he was transfigured before the crucifixion so that when they saw him crucified, how does it end? They would know that his suffering was voluntary. And you see, that is the key. That's what turns suffering into redemption, is our attitude towards it. Everybody suffers. Suffering isn't something that just happened to Jesus. In fact, Jesus came and suffered so that he could take on or identify with the suffering of all mankind. This is what love is, right? Love carries voluntarily. He didn't have to do it. He came in love and bore the suffering, or participated with us in the suffering of all mankind. But part of what's key for this is a kind of voluntary attitude. And you might ask, well, In some cases we could see where voluntary suffering, maybe I'm going to go and help somebody, I'm going to take care of some poor person, and I guarantee you, if you commit yourself to take care of some poor person, you will suffer. Any of you who've actually tried to care for homeless people know it is not easy, right? Some of us have, and we know from personal experience that if you try to care for the poor, you will suffer. It's not easy, right? So in that sense, it's easy to see suffering as something voluntary, where you voluntarily do something to help someone else, and you suffer because of it, right? There we're manifesting love, right? And it is a participation, or we might even say it manifests transfigured life. Because remember, Jesus is transfigured before he's crucified. So in order for us to love, when we love and we suffer voluntarily, it's evidence that the transfiguration is already at work in us, that we are already being changed by the grace of God because we suffer voluntarily. Okay, but what if you're in a situation where, you can't go and volunteer 3 nights a week at a homeless shelter, or there's no clear way? Well, guess what? Most of us live in families. And if you live in a family, you have an opportunity to suffer voluntarily. Did you know that? Christian, you can voluntarily suffer by loving your mother in ways that she finds loving, like washing the dishes, like cleaning up, like, all sorts of ways, like speaking to her nicely, right? These are ways, and if you're a 15-year-old boy, you know that that is suffering, right? It is hard to not do what I want to do and do something that would be loving to someone else, because that is love. Love isn't doing what feels loving to me. That borders on selfishness. Love is to do what's loving to the other person, what the other person perceives as loving, right? That popular book came out about the love languages, right? Different people experience love differently. And particularly if you're a mom, you might experience love real particularly by doing things that are helpful around the house. What if you're sick? How can you voluntarily suffer if you're sick? It's all a matter of attitude, right? I know 2 people with the same sickness. One becomes bitter and angry and vicious, blaming everybody and everything. Someone else with the same sickness humbles themselves, offers their suffering to God, is at peace, right? Trusts in God despite the weakness, right? All you have to read is, in fact, we read it a little bit in the epistle where St. Paul was talking about how he was suffering, beaten, shipwrecked, I don't remember the whole list, but a whole bunch of bad stuff for the sake of the Corinthians. And he was the one who was the father, the example, right? So transfiguration is something that takes place before voluntary crucifixion, right? By the way, especially in Matthew's account, it's really clear. He talks about him going to be crucified, he's transfigured, he comes down from the mountain, he heals this boy, and then he says, I'm going to be crucified the second time, and they don't get it. And then a chapter or 2 later, he says a third time, I'm gonna be crucified, and they don't get it. Like we don't get it. I mean, we can't be hard on the disciples, right? We're always trying to make our life easier. We're always trying to avoid voluntary suffering. But it is the transfiguration. It's that quiet place where you know God and are known by Him that makes us people who can love. Because He showed the way. He made it possible for us to experience the power and the grace. Not necessarily the power and the grace for fireworks, although that happens sometimes. Sometimes something amazing happens. You pray for somebody and there's a miraculous healing or something. That does sometimes happen. But that really there's no voluntary part of that, right? It's my job. I say the prayer, you bring the sick person, I say the prayer. Sometimes God heals them, sometimes, I don't know why, but sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But the voluntary part, the part where I can choose to love, choose to give, and almost always suffer for it, that is evidence of a transfigured life, a life where the Holy Spirit is at work making you like Jesus. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.